Salutations, respected viewers. I'm George from Ireland. So behind me is the house where Charles James Fox spent much of the latter part of his life. So we're in Mayfair, London, one of the very swish areas. Now, why am I always saying that about the place I'm filming is because famous people tended to live in places which are very desirable now, sometimes often very desirable there. The wealthy left more of a mark on history in most cases. So Fox was born in London in 1749 into a very wealthy political family. His father was ennobled as Lord Holland, had been a Tory politician, had been paymaster of the forces, let's say the army and the navy, and a lot of the money had washed through his personal account. And yes, he did have to pay the salaries of the soldiers and the sailors, he had to pay for whatever their accoutrements, but he was allowed to keep the interest on it. That was not considered peculation at the time. It was a gloriously corrupt person if you're part of that golden circle. So Fox had an elder brother. He had a couple of other siblings as well. So his elder brother was due to inherit the title Lord Holland. Anyway, Charles James Fox, he went to Eton, and then he went to Oxford as well. He was at Hart Hall, which is now Hertford College. For centuries is considered more or less the bike shed of Magdalen College. I don't know why this adjunct existed for ages. It's rather odd that someone so wealthy and well connected went to one of the least distinguished colleges at Oxford University, not really considered a proper college at all. It was only in the 1950s when it actually became Hertford College, a proper college in its own right. I don't think he actually took a degree. I think he left early, which was quite common at the time because a bachelor's degree could be 3 years, and 7 years after matriculation. Matriculation being the ceremony when you're sort of sworn into the university. Having passed the exam, 7 years after matriculation, you could upgrade to an MA Oxon. It costs a fiver. They say MA Oxon as in you're not pretending to have a substantive master's degree. It's not a postgraduate research product or an examined thing. So back to Fox. So when he was 16, he had gone on his first trip to Paris, and he remained an incurable Francophile all his life. And he had a liaison with Paris's most desirable courtesan. So he spoke French avec le très grand facilité. Anyway, so he got himself elected to Parliament from Midhurst in Sussex, if I got that right, at the age of 21, the youngest age someone could enter Parliament. So it was a rotten borough, like many of them. That's to say, it was so tiny that it shouldn't have been representation at all. This is before the Great Reform Act, when constituencies were completely unequal in size. Some constituencies only had 12 electors, others would have 10,000 electors. And who had the right to vote? Well, it was men of property, because the medieval legislation said you shall choose from amongst yourselves two burghers from each borough to represent you in Parliament, or two knights from each shire. And who was allowed to vote? It varied according to constituency. It might mean if you owned a certain property like number 12 High Street, or the old vicarage or something like that gave you the right to vote, or if you had owned property above a certain rental value, or you rented a property above an even higher value if you're a copy holder or freeholder, or it was all very complicated, and it was completely uneven. It varied from one constituency to the next. So only about 5% of men were allowed to vote, and no women were allowed to vote by the 18th century, though they had been able to in the 16th century, oddly. Anyway, so he went into politics and he became a Whig, even though his family had been a Tory family. And look at the thing of his names, Charles and James, after the Stuart monarchs. And the Tories identified with them a bit more, like Charles I, Charles the King who chose to die rather than the faith deny, as that high Anglican hymn goes. Or indeed James, of that name the second. Some of them were the abhorrers, who abhorred the idea of excluding James II from the succession. But okay, Tories and Whigs alike had eventually turned it against James II. He wasn't a Jacobite, obviously. He didn't really like the Hanoverians either, but he was a monarchist very reluctantly, because the alternative was worse, and at least it wasn't an absolute monarchy. Anyway, he started to become more radical in his political views, and he was a fairly conventional Whig until the American Revolution broke out. He was very provocative, and there was such a wide latitude for freedom of expression in this country. It's kind of unreal. Turning up to Parliament wearing the uniform of the Continental Army, as in that's the nascent United States Army during the American Revolution, and speaking up for them. And indeed, a former Whig Prime Minister, Pitt the Elder, who by then he was Earl of Chatham, he also spoke up for them, saying, "I would never give up fighting if I were with them." And Fox said yes, they advanced the cause of liberty. Fox also decided that he wanted to have the slave trade abolished, and supposedly unfortunate people who were held in slavery in America and the Caribbean were saying "Mr. Fox for Negro." I don't know if that's apocryphal. So he said his interests were women, gambling, and politics in that order. So he was notorious for all these things. He'd like to lay wagers on a game of cards or a roll of a dice, not to bet on horses, because that involved an element of calculation. He liked something which is just about chanciness, where there could be no rational reason behind choosing this one or that one, this number or that number, or whichever card. It was just a coincidence whether you won or not. And then he thought that a good Whig ought to be in favour of some degree of reform. The franchise ought to be extended to a greater number of people. Now, he wasn't the most radical. He wasn't a sort of a crypto-revolutionary as some Whigs were, but towards the end of his life. And he became, again, worried that some of them wanted rather too much reform, said we should not have religious discrimination against either Catholics or indeed dissenters, that's to say Protestants outside the established churches, like Methodists or Baptists and Quakers and so forth, because they're discriminated against by the Test and Corporation Acts. A test was not as in what are the correct answers or something. A test was an oath to test whether you conformed to the established church. Like if you accepted the monarch as the head of the church, and if you specifically rejected the authority of the Pope. Some of these laws against dissenters were just delayed and delayed each year, always voting to delay it. Others of them were not. There was sort of a limit to what dissenters could do, as in non-conformists, so Protestant churches without bishops. That's in England, Wales, and indeed in Ireland, but not in Scotland, because of course the Church of Scotland is the established church there, or was rather, but and the Church of Scotland doesn't have bishops or archbishops. It's a Presbyterian one, whereas the Church of England is Episcopalian, in as much as that means it has bishops. So back to Charles James Fox, who was a nominal member of the Church of England, who wouldn't pretend to be terribly religious. So some people hated him. A Tory mob once burnt alive a fox to indicate this is what they wanted to do, Fox. These were very fractious times, and politicians would often be manhandled by crowds, often had to go around with gangs of toughs they'd hired to protect themselves from the mob, having their windows smashed, being given bruises by people who were beating them up. Crimes of violence were actually quite mildly punished, so long as you didn't kill people. It was crimes against property which were savagely punished. Grand larceny, punishable by death, malnourished children hanged for stealing bread. And not killed quickly, but left to dance the Tyburn jig by slowly strangling for 20 minutes in front of a baying mob. It really was barbaric. Anyway, he also said the power of the crown ought to be diminished. He had some notable political allies, including the Duke of Norfolk for a while, and he publicly said that George III was Satan. So absolutely loathed him. So for years and years he'd been excoriating the Marquis of Rockingham, and then Lord North, whose bungling incompetence was notorious. Lord North was unfortunately Prime Minister during the American Revolution and kept asking to resign, and George III saying, well, North, you're a servant like any other, my Prime Minister, and I shan't let you resign. So he had to carry on. Didn't stop Lord North being elected Chancellor of Oxford University, something which Oxford prefers to overlook these days, though there is a bust of him in the exam schools. So Blubbery North is always known by that title, Lord North, rather than his higher title. He eventually became Earl of Guildford. Alright, so he was pretty blubbery himself, Charles James Fox. Noted for his corpulence, he was much fonder of gross feeding than he was of taking exercise. Anyway, he borrowed staggering sums of money, particularly from Jewish moneylenders, and because his elder brother, yes, was Lord Holland, but his elder brother was married and for years and years had no children, so assumed that he would die and then Charles James Fox would inherit everything, well, the title, but more importantly the property, and his brother was actually quite good with money, so they used to call him, I think they call him Moses, as in he was going to be the saviour of the Jews, as in pay them back all their money, except then a disaster happened. Well, from the moneylender's point of view, Lord Holland, as in Charles James Fox's brother inherited the title Lord Holland by this stage. His wife was delivered of a healthy baby. Even worse, the baby was a boy, so there's no doubt would get all the property, and they went on to have more children. So he never did inherit that title, or indeed much of the property. I'm not sure how he managed to stay out of the clutches of the debt collectors, because remember, debt was a criminal matter until the 1820s. You could be slung into prison, Newgate debtors' prison or Marshalsea prison, as John Dickens was a generation later. That's the father of Charles Dickens. So back to Charles James Fox. So finally, the American Revolution was over. And he then decided he would actually work with his nemesis, Lord North. There was the Fox-North coalition, a Tory working with Charles James Fox, one of the most radical Whigs. It was jaw-dropping. This was an axis really unprecedented in its cynicism. So he lost some allies there, but nobody believed these two could work together in good faith. Well, it didn't last kissing time, because Lord North couldn't command the support of the House of Commons on his own, and so the only way around it was they presented George III a list of the ministers they wanted. Now, that was unprecedented, because up until this time, the monarch had not only chosen the Prime Minister, but chosen the cabinet. Queen Anne had forced Whigs and Tories to work together, and it had never been challenged that it was the monarch's prerogative to pick all the cabinet. And take it or leave it. You could choose not to accept the appointment, but the Prime Minister, you don't get to select your own ministers. But anyway, and this was a sea change. From this point onwards, the monarch no longer had it in his or her gift to pick the cabinet ministers. The Prime Minister would say who he wanted, and the monarch would just agree to that. But anyway, that only lasted quite briefly. And then Pitt the Younger came in, who came from a Tory family, but was increasingly close to the Whigs. Was he a Whig? Is he debatable, or was he simply a Pittite? Remember, political parties were totally informal in the 18th century. There was no formal membership. You didn't actually join. You didn't write in to join. You didn't pay a subscription. You didn't get a party card. There was no membership roll of any party, and there was no official credo of either party. The Tamworth Manifesto by Sir Robert Peel, a generation later, that was the first manifesto for any party in these islands. Anyway, along came to the Revolution, and he hailed that as the most magnificent happening since the birth of Jesus Christ. So some people thought he was somewhat over-egging it. Now, he had been an ally of Edmund Burke, and Edmund Burke had been a voice for liberal causes, such as Catholic emancipation, such as concessions to the 13 colonies, everything short of actual independence, some degree of reform, and all the rest of it. And so it stunned many of his confrères when Edmund Burke published his Reflections of the Revolution in France, coming out against it. So there was a bit of a parting of ways between them then. Now, another thing is, in 1788, George of that name III had been stricken with porphyria, or so we think it is. The medical historians are a bit divided on this one. We got the symptoms described, was certainly suffering some sort of derangement of the mind. Now, Charles James Fox had become a close ally of the Prince Regent. That's the future King George IV. Now, George IV didn't really believe in Whiggery or disbelieve in it, but the Whigs were willing to give him money, the one thing he craved, because he was a spendthrift, and he and his father openly detested each other. So because the king was indisposed, the Regency Act was passed, and presumably they had to get George III to sign it, and which isn't that a bit of a contradiction? If he's not compos mentis, can his signature actually mean anything? But anyway, he was judged to be temporarily incapacitated, and his then regal functions were executed by his son, Prince Regent. And when the medical board decided that George III had recovered his sanity, then he was able to exercise his kingly functions once more. So he suffered these intermittent episodes of insanity, and during these times when he was not lucid, his son took over. So there was a periodicity to his insanity, but towards the end of his life, he was just completely mentally ill and blind for the last sort of 10 years of his life. You should see that The Madness of King George, which is a fantastic film about it, and it's got all the characters. It's got Jim, what's his name? Carter plays Charles James Fox, and he actually bears a resemblance to him. Rotund, a very hairy person. The eyebrow, some people called him. Some people just drew him as one big eyebrow, who's tubby as well, slightly rubicund. dined well, and had a Luke Cullen feast almost every day. So finally he married his long-term mistress, who had been a courtesan, Mrs. Armistead. She was actually never married to anyone else, but she simply assumed the title Mrs. I'm not sure why. I don't know if she already had children, because sometimes an unmarried woman would assume the title Mrs. to explain an inconvenient pregnancy, because I know obviously unwed pregnancy was considered disgraceful in those days, but London was quite hypocritical. These things happened quite a lot, and if the father or child acknowledged the baby and he was quite wealthy, well, some people think it wasn't quite so disgraceful. So it was utterly hypocritical. Whereas if it was a working class man as the father of your child, then that it was really terrible opprobrium for that woman. So he never had children. So he died in 1806, the same year as his arch rival Pitt the Younger. He died in Chiswick House, which is perhaps 10 miles southwest of here. So Chiswick's a suburb of London. It belonged to the Duke of Devonshire. So he'd known the Duchess of Devonshire quite well. You may have seen that film about The Duchess, based on that fabulous history book Amanda Foreman, came out about 1998. So I was very fortunate to be tutored by perhaps the world expert on Charles James Fox, and that's Dr. Leslie Mitchell, and he's published the best one-volume biography of him. So he was lauded long after his death. There was a Fox Society going on well into the 20th century, an annual Fox dinner. And in that same room where he expired in Chiswick House, that's where George Canning, a Tory Prime Minister, died in, I'm trying to think, 1827, if I got that right. Fox had been against the Act of Union for Ireland. He espoused all sorts of reform, but didn't think that just every man should have the right to vote. So he'd grown up partly at Holland House in what would we call it now, Holland Park, that whole area. It's actually in the park of Holland Park, but unfortunately it burnt down in a fire in the 1930s. Only about a quarter of it survives, which is now a youth hostel. So that he's on the edges of the bon ton, as in which is led by the Duchess of Devonshire, this informal group of very fashionable, wealthy people, and just known as the ton, usually meaning like the good style, speaking in Devonshire House drawl. And Devonshire House was around the corner. It no longer exists. It was a terrible shame that it was pulled down in the 1920s. I'm not quite sure why. In the early 20th century, people didn't value 18th century architecture, unfortunately. So it was the town house of this noble family, the Dukes of Devonshire, who were one of the pillars of the Whig Party. They still have their country house, Chatsworth House. They're said to be grander than the royal family in their manners and the way they have their servants defer to them. So that's just a little bit about Charles James Fox. He's always either known as Fox or Charles James Fox, never Charles Fox, for some reason I'm not quite sure of. However, I think his nephew died without children, so the title Lord Holland died out. When they say Holland, they don't mean the country Holland. There's an area in Lincolnshire, Holland with Boston, so there must have been some estate around there, which is why they took that title. So that is just a little bit about Charles James Fox. Toodaloo.